Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad that y'all are here today. Thank you. Appreciate that. I am Robin Hinkle. I'm the Associate for Mission and Outreach at St. Michael and All Angels Church here in Dallas, over there on Colgate and Douglas Avenue. For those of you who have not been there, feel free. I hope that after you sort of get to know us here, I hope you will come and try us out. We have at our church, we have a mix of contemporary and traditional services in the Episcopal faith. And so there's something, and there's also a great service for kids there called our Joy Service. You can find out all about us on our website. It's www.stmichael.org. And for those of you that are here that are new, what we do is we like to come to a place that is sort of safe and interesting to talk about theological questions that are come up in our world. And so here it's a great place to do it. So let me tell you a little bit of how our evening's going to go. Our speaker, Dr. Elisabeth Kincaid, is going to come up and talk for about 35 to 40 minutes. You should have some paper on your tables. If you have a question that you would like to submit for her, just write your questions down. At the end of her talk, we will collect the questions. We'll take about a 10-minute break. And then she's going to come back, and there will be a 20-minute question and answer session. Now, there's some other things on your table as well. There is a survey there that has a QR code. Use the QR code to fill out the survey, and what will happen is you will be opted into a raffle. Then during the break, there will be a drawing, and you can win a gift certificate for $50 for here at Vector Brewing. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I am required to say that the views of Dr. Kincaid are not necessarily that of St. Michael's. I know, but are of the speakers alone at this time. So let me introduce Dr. Elisabeth Kincaid. I am so delighted to say that she is, like me, a lawyer and a priest. She got her undergraduate degree at Rice University. She then went to the University of Texas School of Law, where she got her Juris Doctorate. She has a theological degree from Perkins, and she has a PhD from Notre Dame. She is now at Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. She's the director of the Institute for Faith and Learning. And she's the associate professor of ethics, faith, and culture. Her research interests are ethics, both virtue ethics and business ethics. She also has an interest in theology and law, natural law, and also work and vocation. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Elisabeth Kincaid to come and take the stage.
Thanks for that warm welcome, and thanks for that introduction. I will say I know an alarming number of you. I was trying to decide whether I know Father Bob longer, but I think Mary Ellen actually wins the award. We've known each other since middle school. So, it's kind of, I guess the advantage of playing on your home turf is that everyone knows you. I will say, for those of you who wonder, I actually am not a priest. My husband, Father Thomas Kincaid, is a priest, and that's plenty of priests in one family, for those of you who know my husband. But it is a joy to be here, and thanks, Father Bob, for the invitation. And sadly, what a timely topic, this discussion of how Christians think about war. When we live in a world that when you open your newspaper or turn on the TV or pick up your phone, we hear about these conflicts all around the world. So I've enjoyed thinking about this hard topic while I've gotten ready for this conversation, and I really look forward to hearing y'all's questions. So when we think about Christians in war, what we're really thinking about is how do Christians live in community? can y'all hear me in the back, by the way? Okay, good. The problem with being in a community in a fallen world is that living in a community often requires some type of force at some point, or some type of exercise of authority. Has anybody in here ever been part of a community that didn't require some exercise of authority at some point? Not violent force. Yeah, it doesn't work. We live in a world in which we have to have authority, and sometimes to enforce authority, we have to use force. So as Christians, when we think about war, we're saying, well, what do we do if we're living in political communities, and figuring out how to hold those communities together seem to require us to use force? And I'm going to just spend some time talking about how the Christian tradition thinks about war. I'm going to tell you a story. But as I was thinking about this story, I realized really it's a story of Christians trying to negotiate between two extremes. You might even call them two heresies. On one hand, we have the sectarian temptation. The sectarian temptation is the temptation to think we can remove ourselves from society and set up our own perfectly functioning community. It's a temptation to think really that we are people who are holier than we actually are. The other temptation is what I'm going to call the sacral temptation. And that temptation is to think that civic government carries more of God's authority than at least I believe it actually does. So we're always trying to balance, when we think about war, when we think about politics, when we think about communities, between this temptation to pull ourselves out of the civic community and go off into our own holy huddle, and to try to make the civic community holy in a way that at least I don't think civic communities in a fallen world are intended to be. So just keep that in mind, this temptation, these two temptations that we get pulled in, as I tell you just a little story about how Christians and the Christian tradition have thought about war. So the reason that I think thinking about war is hard for Christians is because when we go to Scripture, we get some really contrasting messages, at least on our first read. So when you go to the Old Testament, we encounter the nation of Israel. We encounter a nation where God is the ultimate authority. God is the ultimate lawgiver. The people aren't, remember back to your political science class, they're not in a social contract with each other, the way John Locke describes to start a political community. They've made a covenant with God. And God repeatedly throughout the Old Testament says to them, by the way, sorry, I have my notes on my phone. My husband and I had a little miscommunication about who was printing. God, speaking of fighting, God says to them, I will fight for you. I will fight with you. I will go out with your armies. And the heroes of the faith in the Old Testament, people like Joshua, David, Deborah, Gideon, and then in the what we call the Deuterocanonical books, the Maccabees, are people who lead armies into battle, who proclaim God's word, God's sovereignty, God's power. And in the Old Testament, there aren't any questions as to whether or not war is acceptable for Israel. This is an assumed part of being the society that God has chosen. So this is sort of the baseline assumption that you get if you look at the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. But on the other hand, when we read the works of the prophets, when we read books like Isaiah, we also see that war is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is actually peace. The goal of war in the Old Testament is to help the people of Israel live out the peace that God's called them to. In Isaiah 2, for example, we have the really famous description of the peaceable kingdom, the lion lying down with the land. All of the prophetic books say, yes, war is coming, usually as punishment for people's sins for not obeying God, but there's going to be peace. All the nations of the earth are going to come together eventually to worship God. So we have, even in the Old Testament, kind of this tension between God fighting for you and this ultimate goal of peace. So when we get to the New Testament, surprise, things get even more complicated. So if I were to say to you all, let's play a Bible trivia game, what does Jesus say about your enemies? You might quote Luke 6:27 to me. Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who persecute you, pray for those who mistreat you. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you, hand over your coat as well, which maybe could be a whole other discussion about lawsuits and whether lawsuits are scriptural for all the lawyers in the room. Matthew 26, Jesus says, when Jesus is in the garden and he's being seized to be handed over to death, and remember what Peter does. Peter draws his sword and cuts off the high priest servant's ear to try to defend Jesus. Jesus doesn't go, yay, Peter, you're the man. Thanks for finally getting your act together and standing up for me. He says, Peter, put your sword back in its place. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. And then, of course, most famously in John 18, when Jesus is being confronted with Pilate, and Pilate says, why are you here? What have you done? And Jesus says to them, my kingdom is in this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not here. So on those readings of the gospel, it would seem that Christians should never be involved in violence, that war is not an option for Christians, that Jesus is calling us to this really radical ethic of abandoning all violence and just basically letting people kind of slap us in the face and turning the other cheek. But just like the Old Testament doesn't have just one message about war, the New Testament doesn't have just one message about war. And I think what's really interesting is where this narrative gets troubled are Jesus's encounters with two people and then a third person in the book of Acts. And John the Baptist encounter with one person. Roman soldiers keep showing up in the Gospels. And apart from at the crucifixion, when Jesus interacts with Roman soldiers and when John the Baptist interacts with Roman soldiers during his ministry, they're not presented as jerks who are out there slapping people in the face. They're actually presented as people who see something about Jesus that Jesus's followers are missing. So John the Baptist has soldiers come out to him when he's preaching out in the desert and calling people to be baptized. And he baptized them, just says, don't be abusive with your power. He doesn't say stop being a soldier. He says plenty of things to the priest and the people in control in Israel about what they're doing. But he just says, hey, don't misuse your power. Jesus has the centurion in Luke who comes to him, in Matthew and in Luke, we see two instances of the story of the centurion who comes and says, Jesus, will you heal my servant who's sick? And Jesus says, because of your faith, I will heal him. Jesus doesn't say, hey, that's awesome, go ahead and stop being a soldier. Jesus just heals him. He heals the servant. And what I think is really interesting here is we see plenty of instances in Matthew and Luke where Jesus tells people, hey, you're forgiven, but stop what you're doing. He actually tells people to be chaste, and he tells people to give, who have taken money in the wrong way, to give away money. He forgives them, but he says you have to make a life change. He doesn't do that with the soldiers. He just rewards their faith. And then, of course, we have this instance of Jesus saying to Pilate, my kingdom's not of this world. And then what do we have at the end of the story of the crucifixion? We actually have the centurion who's the first person to really recognize who Jesus is. He's the one standing at the cross who says, surely this man was the Son of God. So we have these soldiers who have these unique spiritual insights who aren't told, stop being a soldier, which would have been really easy for Jesus to do. If we go on to the book of Acts, we have Cornelius, the righteous centurion who's converted, who's observing the Jewish faith, who Peter gets sent to teach Peter a lesson about doing mission to the Gentiles. It's not just, oh, Peter, go find some philosopher. No, Peter actually gets sent to a soldier. And again, Peter doesn't say, stop being a soldier. Peter actually rewards his faith and is convinced by his faith that there's room in the kingdom of heaven for Gentiles. So it creates this very strange tension in the New Testament. How do we hold together Jesus' command to avoid violence, to turn the other cheek, to be the good Samaritan, to love your enemies, but also we see people who are doing careers that we might think, gosh, well, this would be really easy for Jesus to condemn them, and he praises them. And so then to make matters even more complicated, we have the real doozy verse, which according to my husband is what basically all my theological research is actually about. It's probably being a lawyer. Romans 13, 1-5, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so bring judgment. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoers. That's Paul in Romans 13. Sounds like maybe there is room for a authority to exercise some type of leadership that comes with violence. So this, as it may be to you all and to me, this combination of scriptures was very confusing to the early Christians. And fortunately for them, they had a while to really think about this before kind of the rubber hit the road. So first, in I think 79 AD, we have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and really the Jewish diaspora. So we have, whether or not the Jewish state under Herod was the same as the state that God had instituted, it was very clear to the Christian followers of Jesus and to the Jews at that time that Israel functioning as an Old Testament state was no longer there. Like, it was gone. The temple had been destroyed, Jerusalem had been destroyed, the Jewish people were shipped all over the Roman Empire. So they couldn't say, well, gosh, the church is just supposed to be, in that sense, supposed to be a political continuation of Israel, so we can say we have God's authority to go out and fight people. They had at Pentecost, which we just celebrated yesterday, they had a relativizing, a breaking down of national barriers. They were called to be a people who transcended cultural, linguistic, national, political divisions. And that message was conveyed very clearly to them at Pentecost. So they had that model. Also, no one in the early church was making any type of political policy. The early church was women, slaves, Jews who were second-class citizens. It was not people who were sitting, in the Senate in Rome, in the halls of the Caesar saying, oh, should we go to war or not? They didn't have to answer the question, the political question that comes with making war. There were a number of soldiers who were Christians who entered the early church, and they tried to take the gospel very seriously, and they admitted soldiers into the church. There were two conditions. One, you couldn't offer incense to the emperor as a god. That would be idolatry. And two, if you went off to war and if you killed someone, you had to do penance, and a substantial penance, 3 to 5 years, before you were admitted back into the Eucharistic fellowship of the church. So they weren't saying, actually, this is very psychologically astute from what we now know about moral injury. They weren't saying, that wasn't a big deal that you just went out and killed someone. No, they said, this is a really hard thing. This is a burden on someone's soul. Take time to repent. Take time to pray. Take time to be reconciled. Don't worship the emperor as an idol. But they weren't saying you can't be a soldier and you can't be in the church. In fact, one of the very great saints of France, St. Martin de Tours, was a soldier and was a Roman soldier. So we see Roman soldier saints. So this is how they tried to hold, and I think did it the right way, together these sort of tensions that I identified in Scripture between Jesus' call to self-sacrificial forgiveness and this sense of, a society may need some form of violence to continue existing, and we're not going to tell people you can't be a soldier and be part of the church. So church goes on. This is not the thing they're most worried about. There's waves of persecutions under different emperors. And in 312, the Emperor Constantine, who is fighting with a Roman emperor rival, has a vision. And in a vision, he sees a cross. And under the cross, either under it or he hears angelic voices, I don't remember, it says, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer. And so Constantine, allegedly, has his soldiers carry a cross into battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and defeats his imperial rival and says, God's on my side. Clearly, the God of the Christians is good at winning battles. I'm going to make sure I keep him happy. In 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, which ends persecution of Christians and makes Christianity a recognized religion in the empire. And in 325, 800 years ago this year, 1800 years ago this year, he calls the Council of Nicaea. So he actually gets involved with church government. So I said there were two temptations. One temptation would have been if the early church had said, hey, you're a soldier, you're involved in government, you can't be in the church, we're just going to go over here and not put ourselves in a situation where we run any moral risk. That would be the sectarian temptation. And there were groups in the church that did that, like not kind of the majority of Christians, but there were groups like the Montanists who were kind of like, we're going to go off and not engage with the world. The other temptation, the sacral temptation, comes in with Constantine, comes in with an emperor who says, I'm going to put the cross on my armies and we're going to win with the cross. And around this time, you start seeing some Christian theologians, most notoriously a guy named Eusebius of Caesarea, who starts to say, hey, maybe God's plan is to bring about the end of days, the end of times, through Constantine. We're going to have a Christian ruler, and this Christian ruler is going to go out and fight with the cross, and that he's going to make the world perfect. He actually starts relating Constantine to the new Moses. He's going to lead God's people into righteousness. So that's the other temptation. The temptation to say our civic ruler, our earthly ruler, is God's anointed, and therefore it's fine if he goes out and wages war and does all this stuff. And thankfully, St. Augustine, who, as you all probably know, really sort of shapes theology, at least in the West, for the rest of up until now, says, whoa, this is a problem. You are getting confused between the church and your country. These are two separate things. In fact, he says it's like they're two cities. We have the city of God and the city of man, the city of humans. And we can't know, looking around, who's in which city. We can guess based on people's behavior, but we really don't know because we can't see into people's hearts. What we can see is that people who are in the city of God and people who are in the city of man share a couple of common concerns. We have very different ideas about what life's about, what's the purpose of life, where we're going, but we know that we need justice and we need peace to be able to pursue whatever the city of God, the church, thinks is important, relationship with Jesus Christ and holiness, and the city of man, the Roman Empire at this point, thinks, which is power and prestige. We need to figure out a way to all work towards peace and justice together so we can go out and get what we think is important, what we think we're called for. And he actually writes a number of letters to Christian military leaders in the Roman Empire and says, hey, here's how you should think about doing your job based on what this says in Scripture. He says, you can please God while engaged in military services, but if your goal is peace, if war is waged, this is a direct quote, only as a necessity, and waged so that God may preserve men in peace. So in waging war, cherish the spirit of a peacekeeper, that you may lead the people you attack back into peace. So he says, look, there may be situations in which it's okay or appropriate to use force. He actually makes his own mistake about this in a different situation. But you need to remember why you're doing this, and you need to do this in a way where your heart is ultimately oriented to peace. So out of Augustine's writings, reflections, most Christians come to the conclusion that war is acceptable for Christians under 3 conditions. So first, that war has to be declared by a legitimate ruler, someone who Romans 13, someone who actually has authority to do this, who has the right intention. So the right intention is promoting peace and justice, we're promoting peace, not promoting the ruler, and is doing this for a just cause. So most Christians, not everyone, most Christians kind of say, hey, this seems like a good synthesis of what we see in the Old Testament and what we see in the New Testament, these 3 rules. So what happens? We have the fall of the Roman Empire. We don't have an empire anymore who people are saying, well, gosh, can you fight for this emperor? Who's the legitimate ruler? We have a breakdown of society and lots of different chiefs, different warlords all over the western half of Europe. And so the church is in a really interesting place. First, the church is the only institution that's still standing. It's the only institution that has a sustained system of education, that has what used to be parts of an empire and now are different countries, intra-country connections that doesn't depend on a understanding of identity. Christian identity is tied with ethnicity. You can be a Gaul, you can be a Spaniard, you can be a Visigoth, and you can be Christian, and that should bind you together. So the church ends up stepping in a lot of ways into the gap that the Roman Empire left behind. So the church actually starts picking up a lot of these duties that the Roman Empire did. And this is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that it gives people across Europe someone who can come in and maybe be a peacemaker, someone who isn't necessarily invested in the tribal squabbles. It's good because there's a continuing tradition that if you're a priest or a monk or a sister or a bishop, you are not allowed to fight. And that goes back to the early church. You can never be a soldier and be a priest. You could have been a soldier and become a priest, but you can never be a priest and then become a soldier. So you have a witness of this kind of continuing peace, this kind of continuing justice in this time of cultural chaos. It's bad because the church ends up owning a lot of secular territories because no one else is there. For example, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, ends up taking control of a lot of the land around the city of Rome because there just isn't anybody else, and they need someone to step in and be an authority. So this tension starts up again. What is the church's role? Is the church's role to be the person who's the uniter, who speaks peace? Is the church's role to kind of stand up for itself and hold on to these authorities that it has, this authority that it has? What's the relationship between the church and secular rulers? What should the church do if a secular ruler comes, say Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, and says, hey, Bishop of Rome or Bishop of Tours or Bishop of Milan, will you bless my fight to go out and fight these tribes? Will you show that God's on my side? So again, this temptation comes in for the church to say, well, gosh, if we can pick like the right ruler and give that ruler our spiritual authority, maybe things will get better. And honestly, sometimes it does. Like Charlemagne made a big difference. I would have rather lived in the French Empire under Charlemagne than I would have rather lived off with like some Visigoth tribe in the hinterlands of Germany. But there's this tension again in the church about how much political authority the church should have, because people are asking the church to exert that, and how much that should lead to violence. So we see this continued struggle really throughout most of church history, from the fall of the Roman Empire, I would say, up into the French Revolution. Meanwhile, while this is going on, particularly in the early Middle Ages, all of a sudden, when you're a nation state and you're fighting another nation state, you're not just out there on your horses, like whacking away at someone with some spears and some knives and some arrows. You have a sophisticated fighting machine where you start to have muskets, you have armor, you have horses. You're going to get a lot more people killed than you were when you were just a bunch of kind of feuding tribal war bands. And so more questions start to come up. Well, can we ever use war? Should the church ever be involved in war? So those three requirements I gave you from St. Augustine, they add some more. They start to say, you know what? War is so terrible that it should only be used as a last resort. Christians should never support war when there are other options on the table. You should only go into it if you think you might win. Because if you're not going to win, you need to find another solution. So you have to have a reasonable hope of success, and the outcome is going to be better than the death and destruction that you know will come from the war. So, and then they also start to say, hey, we need to be really careful when we're fighting that we distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. And if these are starting to sound familiar to you, if anybody here has ever read the Geneva Conventions or anything in international law, the reason this is sounding familiar to you is the people who are writing this, the theologians who are writing this, are actually the people who start international law. This actually all comes out of this is what I write on. I'm really interested in this. This all comes out of theological reflection as Christians start to confront the horrors that come with this new type of warfare that people become capable of. They start to say, yes, there may still be times when there's a just cause, but we now see in a new way, because of technology and because of state power, how careful we have to be about war. So those rules come out of it. The other thing that comes out of it that's really interesting that you all may have heard about, that Father Bob actually had a discussion with Father Matthew Olver at one of these, how many years ago? Pub Theology, like 15 years ago or something, is some Christians start to say, particularly around the 1600s during the Reformation, war is so terrible, it's not justifiable for any reasons. And these are the Christians who are part of what we call the radical Reformation. So Mennonites, Amish, Anabaptist, the people who are very literal readers of Scripture and are just saying, as they look at the wars of the Reformation, there's no reasons Christians should ever engage in war. And actually, if you go to Shipshewana outside South Bend, there's actually the National Mennonite Museum. They depict the church up to Constantine, and then a huge gap of 1,000 years, 1,200 years, to get to Menno Simon. So they actually, people who are in the Anabaptist tradition, say the church was completely wrong on this for 1,200 years. And when you read the words of Jesus very literally, there's no excuse for Christians to ever engage in war. And this is a strand that continues today. It has gone on, like if you were to go to Duke, as a number of priests in this diocese have done, you would be coming out of that you would probably be trained out of that tradition. If you have a friend who's Mennonite or Amish, they would say, they would be a pacifist, and they would say, no, war is not justifiable for Christians under any reasons. All the logic I gave y'all, all those discussions, that was completely wrong, that was completely off base, and you're not taking the words of Jesus seriously. So it's a long historical story. I hope people have lots of questions. This gets us to today. And today, there are about a couple of positions Christians can take. I have one that I think, but which you probably can guess. I'm a just war proponent. But there's a number of Christians who, and this got heightened even more coming out of the Vietnam War, who say no, Christians should be pacifist. War is never acceptable. There are a number of Christians, and this is on the left and the right. This is not kind of a one-way political comment, who I think very easily fall into this sacral temptation, who think if we can just get the right man or the right woman in power and give that person enough power and enough authority to go ahead and exercise that power, they're going to fix everything. So they would say it's not about these limits, this careful consideration that you get in the just war tradition. It is actually about finding the right person, which starts to sound a lot like this description of Constantine as the new Moses, this belief that you just have to find the right person. And then there are some Christians, and this is a very interesting group, who are involved in what's called the right to protect movement. And this has come out, a lot of discussions that's come out of, for example, the Rwandan genocide. And they would say, look, here's the problem with just war theory. Just war theory is primarily defensive and primarily kind of evaluating, like, I'm under attack. Well, what do you do when you have people like you did in a genocide situation who are being attacked? How do you then decide to go in? So there's a lot of Christians who are spending a lot of time thinking about this. Is there an additional caveat that we should add to just war tradition when you're a powerful country to go in and protect a less powerful group? So that's a whole other area of discussion that's very new, that I think was only possible when you got to kind of the post-Cold War world where you had these giant superpowers and then these other groups that you could say, well, does being a giant superpower put additional obligations on you? Of course, the thing that's concerning about that is, do we trust the giant superpowers? So that's sort of where Christians, I think, end up. And I think I think there's some that are better than others, but I do think that what you see is the different emphasis that people put on these different parts of Scripture are going to get you to these different places about war. I personally think, like I said, I'm a just war theorist. I think that Augustine's synthesis is the best way to read the Scripture together. But I'd welcome anybody who wants to disagree with me. I hope we have some Mennonites in the room, for example, or former Mennonites here in Episcopalian. There's a lot of those. So perfect, right at 40 minutes. Open the floor up for, I guess, questions or writing them out.
All right, so that has given us a lot to think about. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, maybe a little bit more. Write your questions down, and people are going to come around and pick them up. And then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes, or 20 minutes after the break, for her to answer your questions. So y'all enjoy. Oh, also one other thing, if you need water, if you're feeling like you need to hydrate, there's a water station over there by the beer to go case. Thank you. Let's bring it back in. Let's bring it back in. I will have to say, I was talking to Bob Johnson during the session, and this may be the most questions we've ever gotten for one of our speakers. So she's going to try to answer your questions, as many as she can. We have 20 minutes where she's going to. Now, before we start that, Sarah is going to come up here, and we will award our gift certificate for the people who filled out the raffle survey. All right, Vanna, let's go. Catherine Quest, come on up. You're receiving a $50 gift certificate here to Vector Brewing. All right, so Elisabeth, if you'd like to come back up here. We have 20 minutes for questions where she will be answering the ones that you've submitted. Thank you for participating.
All right, y'all. Awesome questions. I would answer them all, but Father Bob made me, sort some. But thank you. Thank y'all. All right, so we have a couple of questions about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Some of y'all may have seen the Bonhoeffer movie, be familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German pacifist theologian who was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler that didn't work, ended up in prison and being executed by the Nazis. And these questions involve the fact that he's a pastor, so under the church's teaching, shouldn't have been involved in a plot to assassinate someone, and he was a very convicted pacifist before the war. And I think what's really interesting about Bonhoeffer, first, I will say we've got some great Bonhoeffer experts in the Dallas area, Robin Levin, the McGuire professor at SMU, and Dallas Jingles, who's the associate dean at Perkins, are Bonhoeffer specialists. So I tremble to speak on Bonhoeffer while I'm within their radius. But I think what Bonhoeffer says that's really interesting is he said, I don't know if I'm making the right decision or not. I actually might be wrong in this plot to assassinate Hitler. And he just said, this is one of those situations that's so far outside normal that I just have to step forward and do what I think is right and trust that God's going to forgive me. So I don't think he ever, the movie may have, for those of you else, the movie kind of may have presented him as, he went from being this pacifist to being really committed about assassinating Hitler. I don't know if he ever knew if he made the right choice, but what makes him particularly interesting and courageous is that he was in a spot and made the best choice that he could at immense personal sacrifice. So let's see. I think who am I to speak into someone in that situation from my nice life on Baylor faculty? But where he is really compelling. One, if you're interested in Bonhoeffer, read Life Together, his book about the community, the seminary that they set up, an underground seminary in Nazi Germany, and then his reflections from prison, where he's really asking this. And he's a great example of someone who is faithfully struggling with this really hard tension. All right, got some questions about Israel and Palestine. Is there a biblical foundation for the two-state solution? I would say that I don't think saying is there a biblical foundation is the right way is really probably the right question to ask. We have this nation of Israel. There are real historic reasons for the nation of Israel to exist. Those reasons are not the same reasons that led to the instantiation of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. I want to be very clear that the nation state of Israel now is not the same. And I don't think they think it is. They're not enacting the temple sacrifices, is not the same thing as the biblical nation of Israel. So having said that, I think that if we're called to, as Christians or Jews or Muslims, we're all called to promote justice and peace. Augustine was pretty clear on this. I don't know what's the best solution. I will say that both sides are clearly in violation at different points of a proportionate response. And we see that both sides have been killing non-combatants. I think we saw that on October 7th, and we see that in the conflict now. So both sides are, if you were looking at a just war criteria, in violation of that. So this is an incredibly difficult situation to resolve. It feels to me, not speaking as a theologian, that a two-state solution is probably the best way to get to justice and peace, but that's not a scriptural or a theological answer. That's just me trying to think pragmatically, and that we should, what one of my husband's teachers at Duke, the Anglican priest Sam Wells, would say is that a lot of our issues around conflict are that we live in a world of scarcity, not God's abundance. So whenever you're in a situation where you're saying there's not enough for people, really the call is to expand our imagination to say, how can we live into God's abundance? So I think that is probably the scriptural answer, is where's God's abundance in this for both sides. This is great. Should the church as a whole ever take a public stance on a specific conflict? If not, who and how should determine? First, I will say I would love it if the church as a whole could ever take a stance on anything. This has not happened since about the 1100s with the Great Schism. I do think going back to Bonhoeffer was very involved in the ecumenical movement before the start of the Second World War. And I think it was very important, for example, that someone from the confessing churches in Germany, the churches that didn't surrender to Nazi control, were talking to other Christians who were not in their denomination, who were advocating on their behalf. And we know that the Church of England was doing this. We know that the Roman Catholic Church was doing this. Bonhoeffer had a lot of connections in America. And so I do think that was I think it was this is the easiest thing of the 20th century. It was very appropriate that the church around the world was speaking up about what was going on in Germany and speaking the truth about what was happening. They didn't know fully what was happening to the Jews. They did know what was happening to the Christians in the confessing church. So I think the church should always be a leader in speaking truth. I don't think the church is always the best person to propose solutions. So I get nervous when a church or a church leader says, well, here's the political solution we ought to follow, because I don't think someone who's been married to a priest for a long time and teaches a lot of priests, I don't think that we necessarily have the practical wisdom to say, hey, this is the perfect solution. But I think the church should be very involved in speaking truth, calling out truth. The other example, of course, that I think has been done very well is the witness of the Black church in the civil rights movement. In the power of the civil rights movement and the Black church was not necessarily saying, hey, here are the perfect solutions the church is going to tell you. When you go back and read King's speeches and his sermons, what you see is that he's telling the truth about what was being done to Black Americans. And then worked with people who were experts to help determine things like Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act. So I guess I think that's how I want to answer this. Okay, got a number of questions about claims by another person here in Dallas, not an expert on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but the pastor at First Baptist, who has made some statements about Trump being anointed by God, and it's not just Robert Jeffers, it's a number of other folks. I will say, and this goes back to Constantine and Eusebius saying Constantine is the new Moses, that verse in Romans 13 does say that rulers have a share in God's authority. That is very different than saying rulers have been anointed by God. Rulers are entrusted with this authority to bring about peace and justice. There are no rulers outside of the Old Testament who have a special anointing from God, and that's true. Again, that's true on the left and that's true on the right. Anybody who comes and says, I'm your Messiah, Scripture's pretty clear, or I'm going to save you, whether I'm going to save you as conservative Christians or progressive Christians, we need to get really worried about that person. On this theme of Christian nationalism, which I know there was a talk here, y'all got to hear George Mason last year. Christian nationalism is a heresy. It is there is no such thing as a Christian nation. There has never been such thing as a Christian nation. There are nations that have Christian rulers, Christians in authority. There are nations that have people who have Christian virtues that enable them to follow laws well and are going to be places that are more inclined, God willing, to promote peace and justice. But to say there is such thing as a Christian nation as opposed to a nation composed primarily of Christians is to equate the civil order with God's coming kingdom. And it's to start saying we can accomplish something that is only up to God to do. So I am all for Christians being in politics. I'm all for Christians being involved in the political process. I think that's really important, and that's part of our duty as citizens. Actually, if you buy my book, you can read about my theories about how Christian communities can come together to change laws to make them more just. Little plug. But to say that there is a nation that has a special calling from God, again, that never ends well. So actually, in my notes, I was going to say, well, what about Anglicanism? I mean, Anglicanism started with Henry VIII trying to set up a state church in which you combined the figure of the king and civic authority. And that they kept trying that all the way through Charles I and the start of the English Civil War. And what you ended up with in the English Civil War is you had the king saying, God has given me the authority to appoint bishops, no king, no bishops. And you had the Reformed Christians saying, if we can just get the right people in power, we can have a little Geneva, we can have a New Jerusalem. And they fought and they fought and they fought, and they tore the country up. And then they ended up, after kind of the Glorious Revolution, I think 1682, maybe 88, they had a settlement where like no one gets to be kind of that type of spiritual authority. And as y'all know, we're all waiting for a new Archbishop of Canterbury, which takes forever, apparently, longer than, getting a pope or an American president. And that's because we don't have a situation anymore in which the king just says, boom, that's the Archbishop of Canterbury, coming out of concerns from the British Civil War. So, okay. What about those who say Old Testament God's a God of war and God is the God of love, and the New Testament seems like two gods? This is actually, that's an approach called Marcionism. It's a heresy in the early church where you say you have two different gods. I think part of our job as faithful Christians is to figure out how to read the Old Testament and the New Testament together. That's part of the reason I gave y'all this long discussion on Scripture. This is what Augustine is trying to do, to take seriously both the witness of the Old Testament and the witness of the New Testament. But part of this also involves remembering that the church is not Israel. So what God is doing to the people of Israel as a nation that are committed to obeying their covenants, committed to staying holy, is teaching us something about what it means to be set apart for God. What we learn in the New Testament is that this is not just about civic boundaries. This is about all people being called into that relationship with God through Jesus. So the Old Testament, what happens in the Old Testament as Christians, we believe are the type and the sign of what's going to come in the New Testament, who we are called to be. Okay. Crusades, where do you stand? I actually also had the Crusades in my notes. I think the Crusades are symptomatic of this real struggle that I was talking about between trying to say, well, how much of this sacral, this priestly power goes to the state and how much stays in the church. I actually think our historiography on the Crusades is probably a little off. I think there was a lot more there going on than just like the Pope being like, oh, I'm going to go get some knights to go and kill a lot of people in the Holy Land. There was an active political threat from the Caliphate. The Battle of Lepanto is Arab ships in the Adriatic Sea pulling up to invade Italy. So there's also a political conflict going on. There are spiritual concerns that are less about killing people and more about pilgrimage. And but I think what we see in the Crusades is faithful Christians really trying to work out, how do we hold this together? What's the role of the church? What's the role of the state? If anybody's interested, there's a really interesting book by a guy named William Cavanaugh, who's a theologian at DePaul, called The Myth of Religious Violence, and he actually spends a lot of time talking about the Crusades. Did nuclear weapons change any of this theology? Great questions. Yes, it did. Kind of the breaking point around nuclear weapons for theologians is an argument in Christian Century, I think published in the 40s, between H. Richard Niebuhr and Reinhold Niebuhr, who are the two kind of great mainline Protestant theologians of the mid-century arguing about nuclear weapons. I think what nuclear weapons did is it made this disproportionate aspect that I was talking about with just war much more serious. That people all of a sudden went, wow, we have the power to destroy entire cities. We need to be much more careful about how we use that power. We need to be much more aware. It was the stuff I was talking about in the Middle Ages with the military technology change turned up to 11. So what a lot of people would say today, and I think this is Protestant Catholic theologians on the right and the left, is even if you do believe in just war, because of our military capabilities, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which you have an all-out war that's ever a just war, because you're just going to not be able to have a proportionate response. You're going to kill civilians. A lot of these concerns. Same thing with drones, actually. Someone had a question in here about drones. There's there's been a lot of debate pretty recently in Christian ethics around drones, and I think drones raise a lot of the same on a kind of a small scale. I mean, drones are targeted killings, but the concerns that we see about nuclear weapons on a big scale, in which it makes it really easy to just go in and target someone without thinking about the repercussions of your actions, without asking these hard questions. Is this just or not? And I think we see the significance. There's been some studies done about the moral injury of drone operators, that you have people who are sitting in Nevada driving drones and killing people, and they're actually suffering PTSD symptoms in the same way that someone who's been in an active combat zone has. And I think we need to take that seriously, in the sense that there is a moral cost to this. It's not just playing a video game. And so the way all of this discussion in Christian theology has changed is that we are more serious, more reflective about the cost of what we're doing, because we have so many more ways to hurt and kill people than ever before. Army chaplains, they actually are ordained, and they're not allowed to carry weapons. That's in the Geneva Code. So I actually taught a lot of Army chaplains when I taught it in a Shota house. So it's very important as part of their role that they are not fighting. One more questions. Okay. To drones, Christian nationalism. Okay. This is a good question. So, how do just war proponents interpret scriptures such as love your enemy or turn your other cheek? Is that only sometimes? And if so, why? That's kind of back to the core question I've been asking this whole time. I think the only way, I think there's two things. I think one, if you're very serious about just war, and you're very serious that the goal of just war is peace, you are saying we, as a country, are willing to lay down our lives and the lives of our young men and women because we're so serious about peace. This is a sign of our seriousness and our commitment. It's a sign that we're not going to fight in the way that is perhaps easiest or cheapest for us. We're going to be committed to fighting in the way that spares the most life, and we're committed to peace, even to being willing to fight and die for it. And look, that's not going to convince everybody. That won't convince an Anabaptist. That won't convince a Mennonite. But I think that's how at least this Christian tradition has held these things in tension. And even Stanley Hauerwas, who's the great pacifist theologian at Duke, would say, if you want to find the one place where we see honor continuing in our society, he would say it's in the U.S. military, because that's the only place where our young men and our young women in our culture are systematically trained to be people who are capable of laying down their lives for others. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Wow, what a way to end, man. Okay, so thank you all for being here. We have a few people that we would love to thank. First, Vector Brewing, all you guys back there, thank you for hosting us. And then also thank you all, I don't know if you know our AV team, they do such amazing work, not only at events like this, but also on Church on Sunday and all the times that we get to stream and all those podcasts that everybody loves. Thank you so much, especially Brian, Leah, and Chan. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so join us next week. Natalie Van Kirk will be giving a talk entitled, Did Jesus Start a Boys Club? Gender and Patriarch in the Church. Good night, y'all.